afternoon, everyone. We're moving to the next panel, which will discuss democratization and institutional reform, broadly speaking. I don't think all papers deal with this, but they have their own aspects that they have the question. So each presenter will have 15 minutes. I will try to understand the extent of time and the scope of your presentation. So I'll just raise my hand and warn you when you're near the time. So the first paper is by Fred Cocozzelli, which is discussing the process of democratization and democratic consolidation in Kosovo. So he's looking at the extent to which Kosovo institution, Kosovo state in general, is pursuing this goal of democratic consolidation. So.
Okay, thank you, and of course, thank you very much to Luca and the organizers. It's great to be back in Kosovo after a very long time. Great to see the AUK again. I will probably be, with any luck, I'll be shorter than longer, in the sense that I'd like to keep it moving as much as possible myself. What I'm going to talk about, and let me preface this. This paper is very much about a theoretical distinction within the process of democratization and democratic consolidation, and so it has at its base something of a theoretical question, and that's what are the limits of democratization versus the limits of democratic consolidation. What I'm going to be doing is trying to disaggregate that a bit, right? Presenting one, democratization as something of an open-ended concept, something that's potentially ongoing and applicable to lots of different cases. And then the other thing to do is try to conceptualize democratic consolidation as something that is a somewhat fixed condition, right? That's reliant on particular kinds of particular political construction. And in doing this, hoping to show some of the limits, a theoretical limit of what international interventions can do, right? Particularly in terms of promoting democracy, right? And at the core is an argument that Kosovo could not become a consolidated democracy until after the Declaration of Independence, because it implies this transfer of perceptions in some ways. What I want to do is link this a little bit with past efforts of democratization, mostly within Kosovo, but with an eye towards how these constraints worked, right? And then talk about, again, the Declaration of Independence as something of a transformative moment. And then to conclude it, and this isn't as much as it necessarily seems, talk a little bit about the evaluation of how this works and sort of evaluating the progress towards both democratization and democratic consolidation, with a particular reference to the post-independence, right? Post-February 2008, right? And so what I'm arguing here is that democratic consolidation, right, couldn't happen in Kosovo. There was a limit on what could be done because of the nature of democracy, right? It wasn't so much the nature of Kosovo itself, but the nature of democracy. And that in order to be able to consolidate, sovereignty is quite important, right? If not integral to the process, right? And so let me put that in a slight side note on the constraints that existed on Kosovo beforehand, right? It was never independent previously, right? It was always embedded within some other political system, and arguably it could have achieved a condition of consolidated democracy, right? Within these other systems, had the other systems also democratized to the point of consolidation as well, right? So Kosovo within federal Yugoslavia could have successfully reached a condition of consolidated democracy had all of the systems that it was embedded within also consolidated. So had this had everything gone right, it would have potentially been fine had Yugoslavia itself, transitioned to a consolidated democracy. But as such, it couldn't do that, right? So long as there was no ability to do this. And so in a sense, Kosovo is a really nice case for this because it presents how far you can go with democratization, especially externally led democratization, and what the limits are. Right? So let me talk a little bit about democratization, and in some ways, very little. Right? I consider democratization as both sort of a thin and thick process. One, it's very dependent on the simple, I shouldn't say simple, but the relatively simple problem construction of legal institutions of democracy, right? Electoral laws, the presence of political parties, of political collective actors, relatively high levels of participation, increases in sorts of levels of representativeness, right? But there's also sort of a thicker conception of democratization in that it marks an expansion of kinds of practices, right? That it implies a certain normative commitment to democracy, right? And a spreading version of this, right? The idea that increasing people come to see democracy as a viable way in which to govern, right? Consolidated democracy, right? On the other hand, implies to paraphrase De Palma, right? It's democracy is the only game in town, right? It's in which Linz and Steppen sort of argue, right? In which no significant political group seriously attempts to overthrow the democratic regime, right? And so in that, it would imply that there is no external force, right? There's nothing that can determine a political contest, whatever it happens to be, no external authority that can exist as sort of a final arbiter of political questions. And so for Kosovo, has always been elusive. There's always been some outside force that could make the claim at this, even legally, right? You know, right up to and including UNMIC as this outside force that could simply say, no, that's not how we're going to do things, regardless of what the internal dimension was. Right? And so there's this sense that consolidation being this almost fixed point, right, is possible. But within that, I want to put this other sense of it, that implies a sense of sovereignty, right? There has to be a bounded sense of who can make these decisions then, right? And so democratic consolidation in some ways really can only happen, right, in sovereign states, right, in places that make no acknowledgement of an outside authority, even if there is, this is Weberian in the sense that this allows for the fact that more powerful states are certainly always going to penetrate in lots of ways. But in terms of democratic theory, right, this sovereignty is quite important. Democratization, on the other hand, can happen in all sorts of ways, right? You can democratize anything from, a student group to a trade union to any other function, meaning increasing levels of participation, increasing kinds of electoral rules, increasing levels of representation. Right. I agree that within this process of democratization in Kosovo, right, as I said, it could not really happen, right, prior to this. It couldn't, under the Yugoslav system, democratization itself stalls around a number of very complicated national issues, right, which we obviously don't necessarily need to get into in this case. Although one thing that's particularly sort of significant about this is the process of democratization in Kosovo, which arguably started, you can argue it started at all sorts of different times and different periods, but I would say in some ways it starts even in the 1980s and with the general movements towards increasing participation in lots of other places, right? That some of, right, that what Howard Clark sort of calls this civil society building in Kosovo, that effort was overridden, right, by the other processes that had occurred in the former Yugoslavia, right? And so the increased nationalization, the increased nationalism, the increased polarization along ethnic and national lines overrides this other process, right? And so democratization stalls out in Kosovo in that regard. One thing that's interesting about it is a lot of the actors who were in that process, or some of the actors, right? As in in almost all political events, reappear later. Right? So people don't exactly leave the scene, they just maybe depart for a little while. In the period of what we call the UNMIC period, Kosovo under UNMIC, there is arguably a reasonably good progress at democratization, right? And it's like everything. I think I would overall hope to paint a fairly optimistic picture of Kosovo's progress. I think things have gone relatively well in lots of different ways. But it's all a mixed bag, like every place else. There's some really impressive progress, and there's some really impressive setbacks and even failures. And democratization of Kosovo in part was like this. Political parties did come about, right? There was lots of political oriented organizations, NGOs were formed, civic groups were formed. More so within the Kosovo Albanian community, but also within other communities, right? What I've written otherwise as the small minorities, right? And by that I mean the Turks, Roma, Ashkali, Egyptian, the Varanasi, all of these did develop organizations and a variety of sort of civic actions. On the other hand, right, there were lots of problems with the democratization process within Kosovo under UNMIC. Lots that were talked about, right? Things like weak ideological orientations, not very strong policy positions, right? The overall process was not very strong. That being said, there were also a significant number of elections that were mostly fairly functional and not ridden with violence, right? Since independence, right, there have been, and sort of in some ways skipping to more of the consolidation part, there have been pretty good, I want to call this sort of the unsticking of democracy, right? Or democratization, I should say, within Kosovo. What happens under UNMIC is that there's a limit that you can get to. You can achieve this democratization, but so long as UNMIC exists as what we can think of it as a little bit of a benign authoritarianism, right? It must make final decisions, and in fact, it's part of its role, right? And I think you see this in particular with the formation of the constitutional framework, right? Which with all of these internal debates about it, eventually is simply used more as a tool of governance for UNMIC. Right? But one thing that happens with the Declaration of Independence is Kosovars, primarily Kosovo Albanians, to get the reality of it, unstick this process by making what could be considered a reasonable claim at sovereignty, right? Not everybody agrees with it, it's not universally accepted, but it is a reasonable claim, and one that is reasonably well accepted by lots of parts of the world, including very powerful actors, right? And this matters, right? Power matters in terms of how we read these things. And so there is something quite significant about this in that now you can say, all right, you can democratize and potentially achieve consolidation, right? Because you can make this claim at final authority, right? It may be, right, maybe not everybody accepts it, but the claim is reasonable enough that many do. And particularly important, I would argue, and it's not surprising considering the demographic makeup, the vast majority of Kosovars accept it as being sovereign, right? And so now they perceive themselves in this way, right? And in some ways it reflects something of a declarative vision of sovereignty in that it's all of the pieces are in place and so you can make this claim, right? So to sort of begin to wrap this up, what I would argue is that having made the claim and having now the possibility of democratic consolidation, a question exists of whether or not Kosovo is any closer to democratic consolidation. And in a very, very brief sort of summation, I would say, again, it's a mixed bag, like all things, right? The Constitution itself, as it was written at independence, contained enough references to outside authority that it did not really put the state into a position of democratic consolidation. On the other hand, right, many of those clauses were taken out of the Constitution just this last September, and so there is a sense that maybe the legal structure is getting there. The other really important aspect of this would be the recent elections, which again were quite problematic and were a mixed bag, right? Things went both up and down in terms of the elections. It wasn't always run, it seemed to be run as smoothly as we would have liked. On the other hand, right, there were major issues of violence. It wasn't dominated completely by one party. You can create a one-party state in Kosovo, so there is the sense that things seem to be somewhat effective in that regard. And so what I would say is Kosovo is potentially now getting closer to consolidation, and this is now a viable outcome, right? Something that was not, in fact, true up until the Declaration of Independence. And so this long path to democracy in Kosovo, I think, is now potentially able to be completed. Not by any definition certain, but potentially.
Yeah, one of the guys will come up. Okay. Thank you, Fred. Now we'll move to Roberta Petrillo. Okay, correct. She's going to talk about the parallel structures in northern Kosovo and their impact on economic development, rule of law, and state
This
building.
paper try to address is, first of all, this is a preliminary version of an ongoing research, and my paper is trying to address the impact of parallel structure in northern Kosovo on economic development, rule of law, and state building. We move, first of all, from some questions that are strictly related to the recent escalation of tension in that area. Escalation of tension that started with the barricades and the roadblock of July of the last year, 2010. My first question were, what are the political, social, and economic reasons that have led the revolt and the parallel structure? What the external supranational connection, and as concerned the barricades, who organized the protest, why and how do they happen? The analysis of political opportunities, repertoires, and cycle of collective action, questioning about the role played by the national, regional, and international political context in the evolution of this kind of uprising. What is? I'm sorry. Yes. Sorry. Okay. First of all, we need to address what are exactly parallel structure. The definition of parallel structure is a usage to describe the institutions that have been or still are operational in Kosovo after 1999 and that are not mandated for the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1234. I think that we are not far from a de facto dual sovereignty, and this institution operates under the unofficial authority of the Serbian government and state jurisdiction over Kosovo from Serbia proper, and operate in the territory of Kosovo. This is the first basic definition to go ahead. Let's move to the next slide. My analysis moved from the outbreak of tension began on July of the last year, when Kosovo government sent regional operation special unit to impose a trade boycott of Serbs' goods. Kosovo Serb reacted violently, engaging the KFOR and the Kosovo police in a series of clashes and establishing a system of roadblock of barricades to stop free movement between the north and the south. International and EU mediation efforts to restore freedom of movement were ignored, and the escalation of crisis has led to the violence recent event of this June at the end of the month. While the barricades have been generally peaceful, violence increased during this last year, when KFOR attempted to dismantle the barricades and Kosovo Serbs pushed it back. At today, some protests are still ongoing. Why protest? It's an open question that is related to the protesters who are active in the barricades, and it affects also the essence, the structure of the parallel institution. According to an OCCE report published in 2010, findings from the field point out that the persistence of parallel structures in that area is the result of three main factors. The first is the so-perceived lack of access by some members of the Kosovo Serb community to UNIC and the provisional institution of self-government. The entreatment of mono-ethnic enclaves has reinforced the restriction on the freedom of movement. This is the general perception on the field. And this made it very difficult for minority communities to access to services, including healthcare, education, and social assistance. This is their claims. Secondly, the lack of trust of Kosovo Serb in UNIC and in PIFG, based on their security perception and feeling that they are being discriminated by the two authorities. This is their perception. Thirdly, the political situation and the status question that remain a great obstacle to integration of parallel structures. I think that these elements have to be mixed together with some explicit actions related to the administration of the parallel security in northern Kosovo. Because since June 1999, two main entities have been involved in the parallel security in northern Mitrovica: the bridge watcher and the police of the Serbian Ministry of Interior Affairs, two entities. Frequently, it's an important point, incident-related facts, often met very little as incidents, have been often used by them for political gain. And these actions have strongly exacerbated the politicization of the persistence of criminal incidents in this area, as well as a lack of popular trust in the effort of the international community and the PIFG to prevent their incidents. Some background evidence to identify the area. Just a second. Yeah. The city of Mitrovica, through Iber River, is now, artificially divided in two main ethnicized areas. Around 4,000 Serbs living in northern Kosovo and around 5,000 Serbs internally displaced from areas south of Bar, along with over 4,000 Albanian and 3,000 members of other ethnic communities. The grave war heritage, the inter-ethnic violence, the serious incident after 1999, 2004 and 2011, the extremist organization activities and the pervasive presence of organized crime, this point will be addressed later, together with the toleration of partial functioning of border crossing 1 and 31, Levosavic and Zubin Pojok, together with the weakness of the rule of law and the partial coordination of police and investigation activities between Serbia and Kosovo, created a situation of chronic lack of law in the area. Now we need to address also the root of the protest. There are, I try to sum up some points because it's a very long presentation, but these are some of the main complaints made by the Serbian community. In general, after the establishment of parallel institutions, Kosovo Serbs declared that exercise limited freedom of movement outside their settlement. They declared to be a target of incident against person, private property, and site of cultural and religious significance. According to their declaration, this undermines their access to services and satisfaction of fundamental rights. This is one of the most basic claims. In general, since 1999, ethnic grievances and social and economic discrimination are the main source of mobilization. According to Snow and Benders, if we want to understand the reason why of this movement of protest, we can say that a specific collective condition have to be acknowledged as injust and intolerable and deserving of counteractive action in order to have any potential for mobilization and effective collective action. In general terms, there are three main elements that are conditioning the protest of Serbian community. The first one is their Kosovo, the Kosovo Serb perceived social status. The second one is the clear role played by parallel structure in facing social and economic needs. And in particular, because some Serbs' complaints are related to the lack of efficiency of PISG in address basic social needs. And another element is, I think that is important to underline, is concern the social composition of the Kosovo Serb protest movement. People frustrated by the harshness of post-war, which are found in nationalist politics and identitarian cement. The war heritage and the social demographic misbalance, they brought also inner ethnical change. Perhaps, yes, this is an image of the birthdays in June. Okay, another, oh no. So, mainly we have two basic claims. Partition is the Serbian position. Fresh border could throw at least one community national homeland, creating at least two separate spaces, two separate territorial entities. And the second position is according with the Ahtisaari plan and the four-point plan of Boris Tadic, is decentralization position, based on high level of self-government for Serbia through Kosovo, based on decentralization, region in north with special rights, special status for the Serb Orthodox monasteries, and process for the settlement of property claims. These are the main two options. These are the facts. Okay, let me start to another important aspect related to the shadow economy in this area, because just a second. Yeah. This is a declaration published by Balkan Insight some months ago. It was stated by Roberta, the head of Kosovo Customs, and he declared that large quantities of goods continue to enter Kosovo through the gates 1 and 31 without passing the custom terminal in Mitrovica for final clearance. As you can imagine, it's a huge problem at local level, but also at the international level, because it's well known that certain parallel structures, in collaboration with various criminal groups, particularly with organized group of smugglers, controlled use of alternative routes for traffic in Serbia, for trafficking from Serbia to Kosovo and vice versa. In northern Kosovo, the small form of smuggling and illicit trade are perceived in general as a sort of licit form of enterprises embedded in the local social context. This perception can be ascribed to the social and economic destructuration experienced in this area during and after the 90s. I think that the illicit sector in that area have various nuances. If on one side crime such as trafficking in human beings, especially women or children, produce social blame, on the other side crime like drug, fuel or arms smuggling are perceived as a common form of enterprise. Secondly, illicit practices managed by informal actors take advantage of political and territorial fragmentation. Thirdly, in the considered case study in the northern part, in the northern Kosovo, smuggling does not act as a pre-existing market, but in such words, it represents a market itself. The last consideration here is that illicit sector acts as a provider of service, jobs, and in lato senso of social connection. In northern Kosovo, according to several research conducted on the fields, smugglers hold some public position in such cases, and smuggling activity, as argued by a prominent Italian scholar, Fabio Armao, is a typical business by which the illicit sector tries to emancipate itself from the marginal role of provider, acting and intervening directly in political life. So this is an important point. So let me pass to the conclusion. Overall, Kosovo potential to make possible rule of law and functioning democracy is restricted by the weak governance, the precarious, it's obvious, the precarious economic development, and the contested ethnic power sharing arrangement, and the pervasiveness of shadow economy, especially as concerned the northern area. What to do in front of this specific condition? This case study demonstrates that the comprehension of Kosovo Serb revolts requires a closer look into the plurality of the issues involved. That are grievances that arise from interethnic inequalities, the role played by the international community, the new role played now by the EU, and in particular, if we consider that on the 10th of September of this year, the phase of supervised sovereignty begin to an end, and now the Pristina government have the full responsibility on its territory. And EU rule of law, EULEX mission extended to June 2014. From then, on the role of EU will become the role of EU, I think, will become decisive in support the dialogue between the counterparts now far from resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Now we're going to move to the third paper, where Bislimi of the UK will talk about the microeconomic implications of asymmetric. Is it? Yeah, micro, sorry. Asymmetric decentralization in Kosovo.
My focus today is on the implications of decentralization. You see here that the title says macroeconomic implications of asymmetric decentralization, which is not quite true. When I go to these implications, you will see that some of them would have been there even if the decentralization was not asymmetric. So they are simply outcomes of decentralization, and some of these consequences are mainly derived from the fact that we went through the asymmetric decentralization. You will also see that actually some of them are not at all consequences of decentralization. But the point is that many activities that we have done, we have called them decentralization, and they are not in the reality. So economists will say that the definition of decentralization is very loose. Decentralization is what we want it to mean, but in the reality, many activities that we call decentralization are something else. This is the content of my presentation. I will first try to explain what do we mean by decentralization, not by the government or others. Then try to explain, starting from some of the declared goals of the government, what were the sources or the reasons for decentralization, and look at the actual developments in Kosovo. After this, I will show some elements of the alternatives of decentralization can have an impact on economic development, be it through fiscal policies, through changes in the budget deficits, through incentives in companies, through economies of scale, maybe quality of investments, and so on. And then conclusions. So what do we mean by decentralization? Actually, there are many activities that are declared to be part of the decentralization, but are mainly either part of something that we call deconcentration or delegation. In both of these cases, local authorities get responsibility to deliver public goods or services, but they have no rights in designing them. In some cases, they also don't have the financial means for this. They get the money from the center, and they only deliver the goods in behalf of the central government. What we mean by real decentralization is really the evolution of responsibilities, where local authorities have the authority for decision-making, design, management, delivery, and even financing of these public goods. For most of the services or public goods that are delivered in Kosovo at the local level, financing is provided through the central level. If you look at the developments in Kosovo, you will be able to derive three main forces that were behind the decentralization. One of them is the fact that we believe, or the government believes, decentralization will bring the governance closer to citizens. At the national level, we have uniformity in the delivery of public goods and services, because the center cannot look at the differences in preferences. Once we bring this to the municipalities, we can better reflect these potential differences in the preferences of voters. If you look at the constitution in Kosovo, it shows some of the main principles for the local governance, and we see that actually what we want from the decentralization is more efficiency, more transparency, and effectiveness in the provision of public goods and services, which is another factor, which means the dominance of the economic factor behind decentralization. But then you see that even this is not the main driver, but it is something else. It's a political reason, which is regard for the specific needs and interests of the communities, not in the majority and in their members. When we mean non-majority communities, actually with the developments, we mainly mean the Serbian minority in Kosovo, the Serbian community. Here I have another statement that will show or can give us a sense why we are decentralizing in Kosovo. It is part of the progress report on the implementation from 2012, but it's taken or quoted from the action plan of the Interministerial Group for Decentralization from 2008. It says, again, paying special attention to the needs of non-majority communities in Kosovo, but also create sustainable and effective system of local governance, so a mix of political and economic rationales behind this decentralization. But we see that there are three main reasons for this: either address better differences in preferences through municipalities, allow for higher efficiency in the delivery of public goods and services, and third, pay more attention to special needs of these non-majority communities, and we know that we mean mainly the Serbian community. But no matter which of these assumptions you take, for each of them, which of these driving forces behind decentralization you accept, you always need some assumptions and expectations from the process. For example, if you assume that citizens have different preferences, and this is the reason for decentralization, then you must go from or start from these assumptions. First, that there are differences in preferences. There are many economies that would question this, especially in cases of developing economies. In a case like Kosovo, where the government is not even able to provide basic goods and services like electricity and drinking water, is there any scope to treat differences in preferences? Does it matter if people want swimming pools or libraries if you cannot even supply energy or drinking water? Another one is that you assume that differences in preferences can only be addressed at the local level. The center will offer uniformity, be it because of the economies of scale, be it because the center doesn't know what are the preferences in the regions, and so on. We'll see later that this also is not true in the case of Kosovo, where the longest distance between the capital and the remote areas is 90 minutes drive. And also when we know how the budget was created even before decentralization. Even before that, the request came from municipalities, and it was the center that formulated the budget based on the needs of municipalities. So you could address the differences in preferences even without decentralization. What else we need? Local authorities are better in targeting social spending, social assistance. Here we have a trade-off. Maybe local authorities are better in addressing this, but they are not interested to address them better. Imagine a municipality that is successful in addressing social assistance. This municipality will become a magnet for low-income families. It will only attract people with low tax base and will maybe scare high-income taxpayers. So there will be no incentive for municipalities to excel. Another assumption which will not hold is that it doesn't matter how you supply goods at the local or central level. They can always be supplied at the minimum efficient scale or at the constant cost. We will also have to assume that local governments can address the local preferences simply because citizens participate in this decision making, and the government or the local structures will not be captured by local elites. And this also assumes that local administration is able to implement these new responsibilities. If you assume that it is because of the efficiency, then, or it was because of the efficiency, this needs other assumptions. We will have to assume that maybe decentralization will increase competition among municipalities, increase the efficiency in delivering public services, reduce tax rates in the municipality, and when they deliver better targeted social goods and public goods and services, citizens will be more willing to pay for these services, and all of this can be translated in more economic growth or higher economic development. If you say, well, we are decentralizing because of political reasons, we are assigning more responsibilities to municipalities with non-majority communities, then you have to assume that this will also help, that it is a decentralization that can better protect the interests of minorities, and you have to assume that if you decentralize, this will increase the loyalty of non-majority communities and help or prevent the political disintegration of the country. We will see later that actually the last argument was the driving force behind decentralization, not because this was the willingness of the Kosovo government, but it was imposed in the Ahtisaari plan. So paying more attention to non-majority communities. So what happened in the process of implementing fiscal decentralization? First, new municipalities were created, 8 new municipalities, 6 of them with Serbian majority, or if you include also Mamusha with Turkish majority, you have 7 municipalities with non-Albanian majority, or non-majority communities. And all these new municipalities are very, very small. They have less than 6,000 citizens or inhabitants. 3 of them even less than 3,000. They are a little bit smaller than hundreds of villages in Kosovo. Based on the law in Kosovo, these municipalities have received 3 types of competencies: own, delegated, and enhanced competencies. Actually, the law on competencies at the local level starts with the assumption that it will provide for equitable treatment of all municipalities, but these enhanced competencies are only assigned to few municipalities with non-majority communities, and they mainly address issues in education, healthcare, cultural affairs, and in the election of local police chiefs. The list of competencies that are assigned to municipalities is very long. Here are some of them. You see here, it's only half of the list, but let me take on a few of them. For example, this one that says provision and maintenance of public services and utilities, including water supply, sewage, and drains. It's our own competence of municipality. When we say own competency, we mean they have also the competency to design, implement, and finance this service. But actually, they never got this competence. Before 2008, all public utilities were under the competence of Kosovo Trust Agency, which means international supervision, and after 2008, they are under the competencies of the Kosovo Privatization Agency. So municipalities have no influence at all in the performance of these companies, but they pay the political price for their failure. Another element that is important is this provision of public pre-primary, primary, and secondary education, which is also included or listed as an own competency. But when you look at all the laws or regulations, you will see that this is not true at all. It is the central level that makes all the relevant decisions. Central level decides on the location of schools, central level decides on or appoints directors, central level appoints the number of teachers and appoints teachers, sets the curriculum. So actually all what the local authorities can do is to determine the schedule of classes. So it's not even a delegated competency, it is only deconcentrated, or everything is decided on the central level, even though finance, it's only delegated to, or deconcentrated at the local level. Here another list of competencies that are treated as own competencies. One of them is this here, provision of family and other social welfare services. Again here, we see that municipalities will not be interested to excel in their service because this will attract families with poor health conditions to move in, to settle in those municipalities. Then we have the list of delegated competencies, also a very large list, and you see here one of them, distribution of social assistance payments. This is mainly because of the hope that it will be better targeted, but you see that municipalities have no influence, they only make the payment and accept applications for social assistance at the local level. Here's some of the developments in the reality. Here, this is the map of Kosovo. And you see here these new municipalities that were created. Remember, one of the assumptions was bring the government closer to citizens. Look at here, a municipality created inside another municipality. Or take, for example, this one, inside the municipality of Girone. And if you look carefully, here is what happens with Girone. These municipalities here, this is a newly created and extended municipality of Novoberg. Take, for example, two villages here at the periphery. For these citizens here, it will take 15 minutes walk to the center, to the local authorities in Girone, but they have to change 3 buses to go to the new municipality of Novoberg. They had access to very good health services here, schooling system. Now they have to go to a municipality that has no primary health care at all. So that's why everybody's complaining that actually decentralization did not bring the government closer, but exactly the opposite. And the interest and the desire of citizens was not considered at all. And you'll see here that the municipality of Lipian that actually fluctuates a lot from the center of Kosovo to the east, even here. This is another table that shows the extent to which decentralization can make sense in Kosovo. This is the percentage of own tax revenues of municipalities. They get only 15% of their spending out of own sources. 85% is still in the form of grants from the central government. So actually, you cannot talk of decentralization if municipalities are financially dependent from the central government, heavily dependent. But even here, you have huge discrepancies. Look at here. These are the collection rates at the municipal level. You have a huge range. You have municipalities that collect more than 100% of their planned revenues, and you have municipalities that collect nothing. They don't even bother to collect taxes because they get everything for free from the central government. These are mainly the new created municipalities with non-majority communities. and this has created further resistance from other municipalities that have to pay for their own services and for the finance of those municipalities that don't recognize and accept the central institutions. Here you see Partnership, Zubin Potok and Zubechan collect absolutely nothing, clock up 24%, but starting from a very, very low planned revenue. Another table that shows that the way how municipalities finance their capital spending. You see also huge differences. Here you have Pristina, let me find Pristina, where almost 60% of the capital expenditure is financed out of their own revenue, and we have the municipalities like, for example, Klopet, which can only cover 4% or here even 0. All the bulk comes from the central level. It means they get money to finance general spending, but also capital spending. And if you look carefully in this table, you will also see another element where you see the central government favors spending in municipalities that have voted in favor of them. Another table that is very interesting, if you look at the general grant, this is one way of financing local authorities. This general grant is usually used to pay the wages at the local level. The central government has implied 2 control instruments which made it completely impossible to finance wages at the local level. What are these constraints? One of them is the level of financings, the numbers of the cash that goes to them, and the other cap is the number of employees. And because there is no correlation between these two, you will have majorities that have only 2,000, or communities that have only 2,500 euros per worker or per official, and municipalities that have almost 5,000 euros allocated per employee. Huge discrepancy in the funds allocated. Now let's go and look at the macroeconomic implications of asymmetric decentralization. I will look at the ways how decentralization can affect economic development through the fiscal policy. Because central government has less money left, it allocates more to the municipalities. There is also less scope to run fiscal policy. And even if they run fiscal policy, this can be offset by local authorities. If you want to run expansive fiscal policy, but authorities cannot spend more than annual revenues, they can also not run fiscal policy and others. This can also be affected through budget deficits. You see many municipalities that are borrowing and spending and accumulating arrears. Then through the employment, more employment in the public sector. As an example, the municipality of Geloni lost a lot of territories after the decentralization, but they still kept the same number of employees at the local level. This increased only the employment of the public sector, but nothing happened at the private sector, mainly because asymmetric decentralization has scared investors through the increased disintegration of the country. Then you have the impact on labor market. Some municipalities now are not willing to teach Albanian language to their children. This reduces their chances for integration in the labor market, which has a negative impact on the overall market. Also, our central government has spent hundreds of millions in North in the hope of integrating the country. This is money that was lost, but there is no positive impact. It's the other side, only negative impact. And economies of scale, as we produce at the local level, the cost of production has increased for the delivery of public goods, which has further increased. The cost of decentralization, then we have the spread corruption at the local level. Currently we have several majors at the local level that are being accused for the misuse of funds, or mismanagement of funds. And all of this means less economic growth. Maybe you will say, well, the goal of decentralization should not be economic growth, so why should we expect this? These are some questions for considerations, but Gezim Visoka has been too persistent that I have to stop. So if you have questions, then I can go through them. And that is it. Okay.
Okay, I have a round of questions for 3 panelists, even though I didn't have Besnik's paper ahead, so I think what we said earlier. to Fred's paper, I think it's a very interesting study in the sense of exploring this new stage of democratization of independence. One thing that I'd like, if you can clarify further, is you see democratization as a processual aspect, and then democratic consolidation as an end point. Do we see after independence a consolidated democracy? And you gave some indication with the constitution and electoral processes. But maybe in fairness, we're seeing a de-democratization process, or reducing electoral fraud of elections, disagreements in parliament, and all those processes. So can we consider this post-independence or post-sovereignty stage a democratic consolidation, or are we seeing another downfall on the process? So that you can elaborate. And on the other, just quickly, can you explain how did you choose constitution and electoral processes as the two kind of significant factors that kind of distinct when it comes to the democratic consolidation? And Roberta's paper, I think that's a great fact-gathering evidence for this kind of recent developments. The only thing I'd like you, if you can clarify further, is do we see in North greed or grievance? This is a well-known thesis in development countries, because you seem to make the case that there are elements of grievance, social-economic inequality, disagreement with Kosovo authorities, or do we see greed in a small political elite who wants to entrench? So if you can kind of elaborate, it could be the case that there are both of them present. And Besnik, could you tell us how would Serbs in south of Kosovo integrate or accept vaguely Kosovo authority outside or without the decentralization process? Yeah, like you're making the case that decentralization is a political process and it's not contributing to economic, political, all these dimensions. You strongly defend it, but what would be an alternative in that case? And do you want to answer this question and then we go? All right, so we'd like to ask any question. Okay, Lee.
Yes, Dr. Petrillo. There was one thing that I thought there was something in your discussion. You didn't mention anything about the tremendous amount of money that the Serbian government is regularly contributing to the north. In buildings, in a new university, there's some studies that indicate 75% of the population is receiving benefits from the Serbian government, and that's continuing. Secondly, you mentioned a lot about disliking the PISG. I think everyone would agree that the principal leader of the four municipalities, at least politically and speaking, is Krismir Pantic, who's the mayor of North Mitrovica. Krismir Pantic, who's the mayor of North Mitrovica. He's the principal spokesperson. He worked for the Provisional Institution of State Government. He was working with the Ministry of Community and Returns. Maybe that's just irony, but there was some agreement in that. And finally, I was wondering if you looked at the most recent International Crisis Group report on the Ahtisaari plan, and particularly focusing on the south. I'd like Besnik, if you could comment on it too, if you looked at it. They talked about Gračanica as almost being an ideal place, that it's really working well. They also criticized, as you did too, about the size of the smaller ones. But I'd just like your response to that.
Thank you. One or two more questions. The lady in the back? Yes.
My name is Päivi Nikanen and I'm former head of the Decentralization unit in ICO and currently GIS consultant on local government services in Kosovo. First of all, I would like to ask from Fred a couple of comments about the development of political parties and their platforms and their participation. And Rosetta, would be nice to hear your views how to bring these northern people to the negotiation table in terms of the dialogue and to, how to air their grievances and their griefs as well. And then Besnik, I have to tell you that it would be nice to have an academic paper and not a political paper. I think that you had a number of misrepresentations there, including the issue of privatization agency, including the government's position and imposition of Ahtisaari plan. There are a number of inconsistencies in your paper, so I would like to understand that what is your conclusion? Where are you heading with this? If you're heading with an idea that this was a political decentralization, of course, yes, it was. It was done based on the ethnic issues in Kosovo, and Ahtisaari plan was supposed to be a peace treaty, as you know, which then the Serbs never signed into that. But your government did sign into that, big time.
Luca, are you okay? You want to go with the question?
Yeah, I can ask my question.
Okay, yes, yes. And then we'll have you answer because it's a bit of material.
Yeah, I've got a little point on northern Kosovo as well. This is really a genuine question, also to kind of bring the discussion back onto more political economy terrain. I would like to know from you what your views are, especially from Enza, Petrillo and Besnik, on the economic impact of rule of law issues in northern Kosovo, which is really the main concern of the political economy conference. How does the rule of law issue in northern Kosovo really impact the economic and development outlook in the country? I think that through your discussions, two elements came out. One is the customs and revenue issue, right? There's a loss of customs revenue for the central government, even though revenues are raised, at least for imports that are checked in through the two gates, 31 and number 1. I mean, they go into unmixed own coffers as far as I know. They're not routed into the coffers of the local municipalities, nor are they routed into the coffers of the central government, Pristina. But actually, if you could clarify that on the side. And the second element that came out is that there's kind of a misallocation of investment. There's some kind of allocative distortion in public investment, as you said, Besnik, because there's a political end that's superimposed to the economic efficiency kind of objective in the allocation of public investment. Investment flows more freely into northern Kosovo in order to try to buy off public support. So these two kind of theses came out, but I would like to know more comprehensively if somebody has a more comprehensive view on the economic impacts of rule of law issues in northern Kosovo.
Thanks, Luca. We'll start with you, Fred.
Okay. The question of democratization and consolidation, I mean, if really the question is can Kosovo fail to consolidate its democracy? Absolutely. And in fact, that becomes the question, right? It can continue to democratize. And one of the things I kind of wanted to do here was, at least it's sort of disaggregate democratization from democratic consolidation, and in fact, reduce the sort of linearity of democratization. It can democratize and it can begin to de-democratize, as you say. It's quite likely that under conditions of independence, I shouldn't say it's quite likely, but it's quite possible under conditions of independence without some outside actor who's making some normative claim towards you're going to maintain democratic practices, it could easily de-democratize and never consolidate its democracy. On the other hand, with the presence of some outside actors, such as Unmick or anybody else, it can never consolidate. It can become increasingly democratic in its practices. It can democratize itself to near perfection, but it can't consolidate because there is an outside actor. And in some ways, that's why the Constitution and the electoral processes were sort of useful points of entry, right? Because the Constitution itself, interestingly, opens the door to an outside actor and says, look, we're going to write into our founding document, these provisions that say we will accept, some outside. And so it gives an indication that consolidation is still very elusive. And then this changes a bit, right, in terms of, they remove the amendment. And the electoral process, likewise, is a point where some outside actor could say, no, I'm not going to play by democratic rules, and I'm going to overturn the agreement. And, like I said, I think the verdict on the elections were mixed. I think it was two municipalities that had reruns of their vote. But on the other hand, it wasn't the worst election that we've seen in parts of the transitional world, right? There's been lots it gives a mixed bag. Like I said, it gives you a position where there was post-election negotiations over coalition building, which is pretty democratic, and so you can say there's some good outcomes. The question about the development of political platforms and participation, it's an excellent question because Kosovo, I think in part, the history of the conflict continues to override the democratic process over all of it. It is what people debate about is still in lots of ways not economic platforms. A conference like this in some ways is a little bit of a nudge towards let's pay attention to political economy issues within Kosovo and maybe develop a foundation for better integration of real platforms within political parties. I don't think the parties are there yet from what I've seen in terms of I don't think they're developing ideologically based platforms that move beyond sort of accusations about what happened and who did what and who did it more importantly. But I think it is getting there a little bit. A lot in the paper speaks about, my Albanian pronunciation was never good, so Vetindosi, are you right? Vetindosi. My English pronunciation was never very good either, so I'm hamstrung in my ability to speak in this way. But that they really did represent a very interesting example of mass mobilization that hadn't happened in Kosovo. The only prior real mass mobilization that I had seen among Kosovars was really the Mladic Research Society, which had lots of members and lots of activity, but never became political in that sense, and really was also forced out like the labor unions in some ways. It was sent off to the sidelines fairly aggressively in a certain regard. So I think that was a really interesting development. The fact that they were brought into the political process may be bad for them, and may be bad for the political development of Kosovo, but that remains to be seen. And like I said, I don't know if you will consolidate democracy in Kosovo. I know that.
Thank you for your remarks. I start with the question of, I don't know your name. Yeah, I agree to you, because I think that if we analyze, for example, Nikolic, recently elected president of Serbia, discursive repertoire, we face the fact that Nikolic confirmed an appeal to the traditional nationalistic Serbian claims, like, for example, genocide. I give you one of the recent declarations of Nikolic. He told, what if the Serbs move out from northern Kosovo? Who will accept the result of such genocide? Nikolic told. That is one of the definitions of genocide. When you expel 40,000 people, regardless of whether they are women, men, soldiers, and so on, and when you change the ethnic composition of their territory, that is genocide. He's the president of Serbia. So, what I want to say that here I think that the big issue is represented by the Serbian government and its approach to the northern Kosovo, because if we look the approach of Boris Tadic and his 4-point plan, a sort of revision of Ahtisaari plan, we understand a first tentative made by Serbian government to address the question. But now I think that this new election, the situation is different, it's just a bit different. And this question, your question, is related also to the type of grievances that come from the field. Because I think that the main source of protest is not the nationalistic, is not based on nationalistic claim. I think that the exacerbation of the general political environment is strictly linked to the approach of some basic power group, pressure group, that are active in conditioning some political line and some political strategy. Especially if we look the strict connection between the Serbian Orthodox Church, very active in that field, with the local political, local Serbian politics. And about your question, I don't remember your name, sorry, how to bring the people to negotiate. I think that the EU has still a huge role in addressing the question. Personally, I sustain a sort of moral suasion based on conditionalities, in particular on Serbia. Because here, I think that the main problem is represented by the Serbian approach to the question. And the negotiation is based on the... Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
That's it.
Okay. First to Lee's point on Gračanica, parallel to that, I would also mention the fact that a few days ago the citizens of the Albanian villages in Gračanica are officially complaining that they get no investments at all from the center because all investments are oriented towards villages with Serb majority. And if you look at the structure of employment in Gračanica, you will see underrepresentation of the non-Serb communities living there. So I will not take this as a model. So this is my opinion about the level to which Gračanica is an ideal case to be looked at. And now let's go to Luca's question on the economic impact of the rule of law. Actually, the channels through which the lack of rule of law can impact economic development is in different ways. It can affect the economic development through the lost revenue from custom offices, through the unfair competition that comes from imported goods that have no custom duties there. It goes through the violation of the unity of the tax system of the Kosovo, which further reduces the willingness of people in the other parts of Kosovo to pay taxes. It goes through the increase in the country risk outside through these problems associated with the rule of law. So there are many channels through which the lack of the rule of law in the north has influenced the economic development in Kosovo and has kept the country risk so high. And then to the lady from ICO, she just left, which actually also gives the answer to that. I only mentioned that Ahtisaari plan as a plan that was imposed to the community, to the Kosovar institutions. It is true that the Kosovar institution accepted that plan, but remember, decentralization is not an instrument to keep the elite in power, but it is an instrument that promotes the interests of the local communities. And the only reason why Kosovar authorities accepted this plan is because it was the only way for them to remain in power. I also mentioned the KTA as the institution that manages the public utilities, and this is still true. It's only the name has changed from KTA to Kosovo Privatization Agency, but there is no authority at the local level. This fact that I mentioned political institution does not make the paper political, and the paper doesn't become political if it concludes that the politics has failed. So, but this is a typical response from international organizations in Kosovo. As soon as they see a little bit resistance or critics, they will attack you as being unacademic or political. I don't know.
Right. I don't think we have time for another round of questions. If you have questions, maybe you can ask the panelists in private, as we're having coffees now. So let's go around of applause to the panelists and